Hey everybody, and welcome to the Williams Sonoma virtual tasting of our fall release for the 2020 vintage. I keeping an eye on the comments and see a lot of people are out there already posting some great wines that they've opened. We have a few here that Jeff and I are going to try. So thanks for joining us. Please use the comments for questions. Tell us what you're tasting. So far I've seen folks from Texas and New York and Illinois and, from all over. So we appreciate you guys being here. What we're going to do today is Jeff Mangahaus, our director of winemaking, and myself will go through a little bit about the vintage, tell you what's going on out in the vineyards right now, and then walk through about half the wines from the fall release. I will tell you, as you probably remember from spring, quantities are much lower with the 2020 vintage, and the wines are selling out faster than they've ever sold out. That's something we can't really control. I think it's part of the pandemic, people being used to ordering online, and we definitely have seen wines moving much faster. So I do encourage you all that when Monday comes around, for those who are in the main release, that to jump on it early and order quickly. And apologize for the smaller allocations. Things should be back to normal next year with the 2021 vintage, and Jeff will tell you how the 2022 vintage is looking. So let me bring Jeff in, and Jeff.
Hey, everybody.
I'm going to hand it over to Jeff for a little bit, and then we'll both be talking about the wines when we get rolling here.
Sounds good. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Got some exciting wines to try today, and I'll give you a little sneak peek of what's going out in the vineyards right now. Let's start with the 2020 vintage. If you tuned in the springtime, I kind of outlined what was going on with the 2020 vintage. Just kind of a quick recap. 2020 was kind of the start of coming off 2019, where we had abundant rain fall in the winter months. 2020 started out pretty dry. In fact, that's 2022 today. We're in a historic drought in California. I'm sure many of you have been either experiencing that or have read about it. And it started with the 2020 vintage. About 60% less rainfall than average in 2020. It was kind of a cool early springtime. So bud break was a little bit on the later side, which is sort of unusual. Typically, the drier the weather, or drier the season, I should say, the drier the soil tends to be, and that tends to drive bud break earlier. But because the ground was so cold, it kind of delayed things a little bit. So that was kind of unusual for the vintage. We did get a little bit of rain in the springtime that kind of helped recharge the plants a little bit. So overall, it was a pretty good growing season. Lots of sunshine. You've heard me talk about the growing degree day, where it's kind of a summation of the heat units throughout the growing season. And as it turned out, by the time we got to the month of August, it'd been one of the warmest and driest growing seasons on record. By my calculations, it was between 10 and 12% warmer than average, which is pretty significant, actually. So kind of the net effect of that was a lot of the nice sunshine on the plants and on the clusters really developed terrific color for the 2020 vintage. Lots of brown seeds, lots of brown stems. These are all things that I look at in trying to determine, the harvest. So there was a lot of evenness, I think, from a tannin development in the wines. What I'm finding as I'm tasting the 2020s today, kind of keep checking in on them, lots of robust kind of tannins. Polish, I think, to the tannins, but there's a significant amount of tannin in the wine, and that kind of relates back to the abundant sunshine for the vintage. We in fact started. It was such a wonderful late growing season. We started harvest on the 12th of August in 2020. And as I've talked about in the past, the Walbridge fire, the unusual lightning events happened in around the 16th and 17th of August, and that created some lightning strikes that started the Walbridge fire out on the coast. Long story short, I mean, we were picking grapes even before the fires were happening, and even before the smoke kind of settled. So I feel like we're in a really good spot. I mean, we made much less wine, as Mark had alluded to in the beginning. But the wines that we made were really terrific. They've tested clean. They have really nice concentration because of the really good growing season. With that said, vineyards that were on the coast that were not anywhere near sort of being ready for harvest. Unfortunately, there's no Precious Mountain this release. There's no Coastlands. We're actually on starting to source grapes again from the Hirsch Vineyard. So we didn't make that wine in 2020. What else didn't we make? Terra de Promesio was another vineyard that was affected. So, really excited to showcase these wines. Hopefully you've already, tasted some of the 2020 spring wines that you purchased last release. And I think they're really showing terrific. We're actually getting some really great feedback from reviewers and so forth. So the wines are really showing their, the vintage characteristic as well as the signature Williams-Sellium kind of characteristics as well, the traits as well. So, sorry, I was out in the vineyards today, so a little dust, I think, in my throat there. Flash forward to the 2022 vintage. Really terrific growing season, nice and cool overall, really nice fruit set, kind of average to maybe a little bit less than average kind of crop loads on the plants just due to the flowering weather. But it's been a very nice, cool growing season. And kind of using that growing degree day calculation, it looks like the weather is pretty similar actually to the weather that we had in 2013. And if you're a big fan of the 13s like I am, those wines are showing really terrific right now. So I'm actually quite excited about the 2022 vintage. The weather's been perfect thus far, nice and cool. Had some rain events in late May, June to kind of refresh the plants. Again, we're in a historic drought. And so the plants have been kind of revived with that little bit of rain, in addition to sort of the return of the fog, which helps kind of hydrate the plants and keep everything fresh. So I'm quite excited about this vintage. I've been doing some grape sampling actually for the last couple of days. We just finished bottling the spring release wines for the 2021 vintage, and which are terrific. And we're kind of focusing on the new vintage. It looks like many of you, even here at the winery, we've been talking about around the 10th, 11th, or 12th for the start of harvest for the 2022 vintage, and that's looking to be the case right now. So more to come on kind of the first pick, which might be happening Tuesday or Wednesday next week. So Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday next week. So yeah, let's jump into the wine. So Mark.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. So we're going to taste 10 wines today. We're going to start with a couple of Chardonnays. So first up is the 2020 Allen Vineyard Chardonnay. Allen Vineyard is located right on West Side Road and was planted in the late 60s by Joe Rocchioli, who had farmed the property for the Allen family. It is one of the classic Russian River Valley vineyards, and this Chardonnay, I actually coincidentally tasted it last night on a local radio show, and so I know how it's doing even before smelling and tasting it. It's got great acidity, beautiful fruit characteristics. But Jeff, why don't you tell us what you think of this wine and what you're getting here?
Yeah, classic spot. I mean, here on West Side Road, I mean, there's the Rocchioli Vineyard, the Allen Vineyard, and a couple of other really outstanding vineyard sites for Chardonnay. This Chard always has, to me, a great structure. I mean, you talked about the acidity, but something that we don't often talk about, and I think I've talked about it on other webinars, where the structure related to like the tannins, the natural tannins in the grapes, really kind of help develop and give the wine a little bit more density and richness without kind of sugar and that kind of thing, or tannins from barrels. Chardonnay, in sites when there's struggle in the plants and it's a excellent site, the skins tend to be rather thick. Even though we're not fermenting Chardonnay on the skins in the pressing cycle of the production of Chardonnay, you are extracting some of the rich tannin structure that's in the grape, and that translates into the final product. And so, yeah, along with that great acidity, I think I always describe Allen Chardonnay as having great structure to it. And it gives the wine complexity and length and sort of fatness on the palate. Typically, I get a lot of, which I'm getting out of it today, there's sort of that apple skin kind of quality to it, yellow apple, maybe even some of the local kind of like Gravenstein apple characteristics. Yeah, you got the technical notes there. I mean, terrific acidity and pH, and that's what keeps the wine fresh. And to be honest, gives it some longevity from because of that low pH. So great nose. A little reminder about how we make Chardonnay. So the two wines that we're tasting today are barrel fermented, right? So we pick the grapes at night, nice and cold. We press them relatively quickly. Chardonnay is actually hand sorted as well, just like all of our red wines. And it effectively goes straight from the press to a holding tank just to homogenize all the pressings. And then it goes straight to barrel. There the barrels slowly start to ferment. Very nice, long, slow fermentation, cool temperatures, 50 to 55 degrees. And that kind of helps trap some of the esters and the aromatics. It kind of keeps them sort of trapped in the barrels, and that keeps the wine nice and fresh. All barrel fermented, all 100% malolactic fermentation in the wine. And sometimes actually even like last year, the fermentations, the malolactics kind of struggled a little bit because the pHs are nice and low. And that's not a bad thing. It just helps kind of, I think, create a little bit more complexity and layers in the wine. Bottled, unfined, unfiltered, after on average about 15 months and about 25 on average, about 25% new oak. So.
And Jeff, do we, I know that for the Pinot Noirs, we're, Francois Frere for, 99% of what we do. What's the barrel program with the Chardonnay?
Yeah, so the Chardonnays typically play around with two types of coopers, all French, of course. One of them is Taranceau, which offers really nice tannin structure, very refined tannin structure. Same with what's called a water bent barrel. It's called Marcel Cadet. And it's interesting if not to go down into a rabbit hole, but barrels can be made in a lot of different ways. And the Marcel Cadet is interesting because typically when you're crafting a barrel before it's actually toasted, the wood can be slightly toasted. So this is the way a Francois Frere and a Taranceau barrel are made. They're slightly toasted to bend the wood to create the shape of the barrel. And with Marcel Cadet, the barrels are actually submerged in 180-degree water, which softens the wood and creates the bend. And then the barrel could be crafted, the rings put on it, and then toasted. So it's a slightly different methodology, but it actually imparts a real elegance to the water bend barrels tend to offer a little bit more elegance. And so I think the combination of the two in small quantities really kind of craft, help support what's naturally there. So.
And Jeff, a question about the style of Chardonnay.
Yep.
You know, Bert started making Chardonnay back in the early to mid '80s, and we've had Chardonnay on the roster ever since. Do you think the style has been consistent, or are you doing something different that Bert and Bob different from what maybe Bert and Bob did in winemaking?
Yeah, I mean, Chardonnay can be real showy for sure, and what I've done over the past couple of years, I think certainly since 2014 when I took over, is sort of I'm picking a little bit earlier, picking with maybe a little bit more freshness. I do like seeing, I'm inspired by great, you know, um, Chardonnays from Burgundy, for example, which tend to have great acidity to them. So, I think by picking maybe a little bit earlier, I'm kind of preserving some of that natural freshness, which is certainly to my liking, and hopefully to your liking as well. I think the wines have a terrific balance and still with a lot of potential ageability, right? So, with the right food, I mean, even this young 2020 could be quite delicious, right? Something rich. I think in my tasting notes, I often talk about like shellfish, crab, lobster, those kinds of things that would be a terrific pairing with the acidity and subtle minerality, I think, in this wine too, right?
I don't think the minerality is subtle at all. I get that's fairly dominant in it.
Yeah.
Um, as we move on to the 2020 Lewis McGregor Estate Chardonnay, you mentioned aging Chardonnays. Generally, what do you recommend for a rule of thumb to age Chardonnays? Obviously, like you just said, you could drink this 2020 tonight and be very happy with it. What's
Yeah.
the aging curve on that?
Yeah, I mean, like so many things, even whatever wine it is, personal preference is always, going to supersede anything that I say. So, I think that's number one. Enjoy the Chardonnay that you like to enjoy when you want to enjoy it, no matter what age it is. But, it's not unheard of, when I talk about Pinot Noirs, I tend to push the envelope a little bit, and I want to be in that 7 to 10 year range for these vineyard designate wines. And I wouldn't be shy about saying, 7 years on a great Chardonnay with structure like the Allen or the McGregor, for example. Um, at a minimum, I think they need a couple of years from the vintage date. So, I know I'm being sort of ambiguous about it, but I think between that 3 and 7 years is going to be the sweet spot for probably most people. I happen to love aged wines, and I've been enjoying some older Olivet Lane Chardonnays that of ours that that are terrific at 8, 9 years old. So
Yeah, I think I saw, if I remember, Marshall Gelb is drinking a 15 Olivet Chardonnay right now.
yeah.
Yeah,
And how is it?
he said it was
What did he
fabulous.
say?
Um,
Okay, cool. So there you go.
yeah,
So
I tend
yeah,
to do mine, age mine about 3 years,
yep,
but I also have what I refer to as the accidental aging program, where I lose wine in the cellar. So sometimes I end up with something, 7 to 10 years that is, for the most part, sometimes interesting and sometimes fabulous.
yeah.
Um,
And just even as an aside, I mean, I know we're not talking about the unoaked Chardonnay, but man, I had a 2012 unoaked Chardonnay not long ago, and it was terrific, right? I mean, great structure to a great acidity. That's what typically that wine has. Doesn't need the oak necessarily to age, right? Because we're using older vines in particular for the unoaked Chardonnay to give it that richness that you're not getting from the oak aging kind of part of it. So, yeah, 10-year-old stainless steel Chardonnay, terrific.
Yeah, and I should clarify. Someone made a comment about my luxury problem of losing wine in the cellar. It's because I have double racks, so you can do 2 bottles per rack, and sometimes if it's in the wrong corner, you don't see it for a couple of years. But yes, that is a high class problem. Okay, let's move on to the Lewis McGregor Chardonnay.
Yeah,
The
so
so
vineyard that we purchased in 2014, named after John's grandfather, Lewis McGregor. That was really important in his life. getting him into agriculture, and John's a force of nature in the agriculture and certainly viticultural world. So it was an homage to those roots. 2014, we bought this vineyard. It's on the east side of the Russian River, so kind of a mirror image, actually, of where the estate is, if you've been to the estate. But on the other side of the, just over the hill, on the other side of the winery, on the east side of the Russian River. This is kind of interesting. It's a clone that we call around here Old Wenty. And Old Wenty has a really interesting sort of cluster morphology. The clusters are rather small. Chardonnay is, there's the whole gamut of size and kind of look and feel of a Chardonnay cluster. The typical California Chardonnay cluster is what's called Clone 4, which we don't have a lot of planted, actually, honestly. But it's a really massive, big cluster. Sometimes they can they can be up to a pound in weight per cluster. But the Old Wenty is a really tiny cluster. It only, it's a very loose, gangly, small berries. And, it has a very peculiar smell. And to me, anyways, where it often smells like pears, right? Spiced pears, green pears, that kind of thing. And it's really, no matter where I smell and taste Old Wenty Chardonnay, it always has that sort of characteristic. Also typified by really great acidity. So just even comparing and contrasting these two Chardonnays that are on opposite sides of the river, the Old Wenty has a completely, or the Lewis McGregor Chardonnay has a completely different aromatic profile. Wouldn't you agree, Mark?
Yeah, and it is so different from the Allen, and where I think the Allen kind of jumps out of the glass a little bit aromatically, where the McGregor, on my third or fourth time going back to smell it, now I'm getting those pear characteristics coming out of it. But they're very different wines. And I know, we talk about, especially with the Pinot Noir, but I think the same applies to Chardonnay, is, when you make so many different wines, I think we're up to 8 barrel fermented Chardonnays now. You're making them all in the exact same way.
Yeah, no, for sure. Absolutely.
So the differences are the clone and the vineyard, and not really the winemaking.
No, for sure. This wine, this clone, this site tends to deliver, I think, even more minerality. And yeah, no, I mean, it's much like, just like when, to echo what Mark said. I mean, the Pinot Noirs are all made in the similar fashion. These are all made in a similar fashion. So yeah, it's really the place that has the imprint, or the fingerprint of the wine. And that's kind of cool to see. And I think really, I mean, it's an astounding number that at Williams-Sonlium we make 52 different types of wines, right? And they are
Different
unique,
bottlings.
different bottlings,
Yeah.
and they're all unique and different. 25 different Pinot Noirs, and they're all unique and special in their own way, and that's the point for sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah, perfect wine.
I've said, the best example I can give is if you have the entire lineup from the fall, or in this case, the 6 Pinots we're going to taste today, they're all going to be wildly different. But one really interesting thing is if you took the 2 most extreme different wines and put them in a blind peer group, you'd actually notice the similarities, because
sure.
the winemaking style does impart flavor. The yeast strain we use imparts flavor. The barrel we use imparts flavor. So you do get a house style, even though there can be wildly divergent expressions of that style, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the, just kind of along those lines, I mean, one of the really interesting Chardonnays that's come into, the portfolio over the last couple of years is this vineyard way out on the coast called Three Sisters. And it's a Sonoma Coast Chardonnay, and, grows up on a mountaintop, got the coastal kind of fog influence, coastal effect. Wow, that wine's so different. It's got structure. It's got, again, that tannin structure to it. It's a really robust wine. But when you're ever out on the coast, you're hiking out on the coast. Anybody can attest if you've been out to the true Sonoma coast, you kind of get that foresty kind of smell, right? I mean, it's like being amongst the redwood trees and the pine trees out on the salty sea air. And somehow that really translates into the Three Sisters Chardonnay, right? You get that sense of piney, foresty kind of qualities to it. So it's an example of definitely unique site translates into a really unique and special wine. So yeah, if you haven't tried the Three Sisters, it's an amazing expression of Chardonnay. So
yeah, we are sold out of it. Somebody in the chat was asking.
Oh, sorry about that.
See, this is why you should look at the chat, Jeff. I know it's distracting.
Yeah. I actually just called it up. So, but yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on to the Pinot Noirs. First Pinot Noir that we're going to try is the only non-vineyard designate in the lineup, which is our 2020 East Side Road Neighbors Pinot Noir. So for those of you who have visited the winery, we're located on West Side Road. We're on the west side of the river. It won't be shocking to you that there's an East Side Road on the east side of the river. So back in 2003, when we started making West Side Road Neighbors, that was literally a blend of our neighbors' vineyards along West Side Road. So West Side Road, which is a spring release wine, was Rocchioli, Allen, Bucher, Bacigalupi, and our estate vineyard eventually. Then in 2009, we started getting fruit from the Foss family and the Caligari family, which they're both located on or adjacent to East Side Road. And then there were a couple of vineyards that our vineyard manager, Chris Boland, was also farming. And we started making an East Side Road Neighbors Pinot Noir. And it was a great way to get to try out these vineyards on East Side Road without yet making a vineyard designate. Now then, in 2011, I think, was our first year that we did vineyard designates of Foss and Caligari. And then in 14, we bought what we renamed to the Lewis McGregor Vineyard, which again is just maybe, 200 yards off of East Side Road, 200 or 300 yards off of East Side Road, and borders up against you can see the Foss Vineyard when you're in the Lewis McGregor Vineyard. So this is a blend of now those three that I've mentioned. I didn't leave anybody out of the
that's it. Yep.
Okay. And what I find with this wine is when you're looking at the fall wines, the East Side blend tends to be one of those wines that, while it can age just like a vineyard designate, it definitely is ready to go on the earlier side compared to, say, a Rocchioli Vineyard or an Allen Vineyard, something like that. So I actually haven't tried this wine yet. I'm pretty excited, Jeff.
Yeah. So, I mean, those three vineyards, and what's kind of cool, if you're familiar with, and we'll actually taste two of the components of this wine. So later in the flight, the Foss Vineyard and the Lewis McGregor. And you'll see how unique and idiosyncratic, I guess, those particular wines are. So what's really fun about crafting a blend, whether it's West Side or East Side or even Russian River Valley AVA wine, is how all the different components work and play together, right? So taking the richness and the fatness of say the Foss Vineyard with the acidity and the minerality of the Lewis McGregor Vineyard, you put those together, and actually in some ways it creates a little bit more complete picture of a region. West Side Road tends to be, in my opinion, which is a spring release, that wine tends to be a little bit more mineral driven, a little bit more red fruited. I would classify the east side of the river, especially on the hilltops where these vineyards are, captures a little bit more sunlight, drier soils, more gravelly kind of soils. So that tends to actually drive, I think, a little bit more richness in the wines. Typically, the east side, the vineyards on the east side of the river tend to bud break first. And so, in fact, still debating on which blocks to pick, but the McGregor vineyard will be probably the first pick next week, right? So that's easily about a week to 10 days before anything on the west side of the west side of the river. So definitely drier soils, earlier to bud break, and therefore earlier to harvest.
And Jeff, the vines are slightly younger plantings for Eastside
Yeah,
versus?
certainly at the McGregor Vineyard, not necessarily compared to say Rocchioli and Allen, yes, but there are some reasonably old vines. Caligari, which we're not tasting today, is, if I'm not mistaken, is in the 20-year-old kind of range, so pretty decent.
Yeah.
And Foss not far behind that, maybe 15 years old.
Yeah, and then with a lot of West Side Road being replanted over time, things will probably, they're starting to even out in terms of vine age, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when, kind of describe the West Side Road a little bit, minerality, red fruit. And so the drier, warmer side of the valley, tends to deliver, which is the east side, tends to deliver more of that, berry fruit character, rich, kind of fat tannins, if you will. I mean, it's right out of the glass. This is just sort of jumping out as, berry fruits, raspberries, black raspberry, that kind of thing. Really terrific polish, I think, to the tannins as well, which is also kind of, to me, a hallmark of kind of a warmer site where the tannin profile on the vine as they're ripening is, very even, lush kind of tannins.
So great question that just came up. And I'll start the answer, but Jeff can get in with more specifics. Have you always picked the fruit this early, or is it a new trend? Well, it's been trending this way for the better part of the last 10 years. So when Bert Williams was still alive and in the winery, I told him about that we actually picked the 15 vintage, if I recall. The first pick was on July 29th. And he said, I never even picked in August. And the reason that, and Jeff will go into the reasons, but it's a combination of factors, a big part being driven by climate right now. But Jeff, can you give a little more robust answer to earlier picking and what's driving that? Because I know some of it is planned on our part as well, and how we farm in the winter and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated answer, but really the most illustrative sort of response would be, the earlier the bud break, the earlier the flowering, and therefore the earlier the harvest, right? So yeah, it's climate change in the sense that, I think the biggest factor that's influencing when we pick is how dry the soil is. And so, as I kind of started out the discussion today, drought seasons, earlier bud break. The plants are kind of interesting because they have sort of a bit of an internal clock, right? So when, from flowering to the harvest date, assuming picking bricks, picking at around 23 bricks, which is about where, sort of the sweet spot for us. That's actually a regular cycle, right? So if the timeline has moved up 2 weeks or 3 weeks or what have you, in terms of when things bud break and then flower, that timeline's pretty rigid in a way. So the earlier picking, so like 2015, Mark's right, we picked in at the end of July, but we also had bud break in February, which is easily a month earlier than we know, and that was in the middle of the drought. That was towards actually the 5th year in a 6-year drought. So that was the biggest factor there. Climate change involved, sure. Drought, lack of rainfall, all those things are definitely, kind of climate driven. And so it's, I hate saying that it's an early season because it's not necessarily, I mean, it's an early season, but the internal clock is still the same. If that, does that sort of make sense?
Yeah. So when we're farming, if we are pruning in December versus January, let's say, and that inspires bud break a few weeks earlier, then you're going to be picking a few weeks earlier.
Sure.
So so part of it's nature and part of it's planning on our part, right?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
definitely. And then, the quantity of the set or the quality of the set, in the sense that if the plants are nice and healthy and you have a very, very light crop like we did in 2015, that also kind of drove, if you kind of think of a really super healthy plant pumping all this ripeness and sugar and, hormones and all that sort of stuff into ripening the fruit. If there's less fruit, it just happens a little bit faster as well. So the very, very light crop years tend to also be a little bit earlier. But kind of the advantage of that, what I actually think of as a positive is, we're being able to get ripeness, meaning tannin ripeness, seed ripeness, skin ripeness, that kind of thing, at lower sugars potentially, right? So I'm looking at next week's picks, with beautiful, beautiful low pHs, high acidity, at relatively low potential alcohol. So I think from a balance perspective, I think the wines can be quite interesting. And the greatest example is the 2015 vintage, where we had the lowest potential alcohols we've ever had, but at the most concentration and the most ripeness of tannins. It was a terrific vintage. So yeah, that was a great question.
All right, so let's move on. So the 2020 Vista Verde Pinot Noir. Um, Vista Verde is down about 20 miles inland from Monterey. Yep, great, great rocky soil, high elevations. It's a large vineyard that is owned by John Dyson and William Sellium, but the majority of it is farmed differently than we would farm at William Sellium. Jeff has kind of cherry picked a few blocks to grow some Pinot Noir. It's also the source of our Central Coast Pinot Noir. That's just a different block from the same vineyard.
Yeah.
So it's down in outside of Hollister.
Yeah, Tres Pinos is the nearest town outside of Hollister.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's kind of unique about this? So, a lot of limestone in this part of the world, right? So, hillside. These are typically really steep slopes, high lime in the soils. It's a bit of an experiment in a way, because there's a lot of different clonal selections that we kind of play around with, but the overarching sort of factor here is the limestone in the soil. And to me, that kind of creates a wine that has, I mean, you smell and taste it, and it immediately has sort of this berry fruit quality, different from the Russian River. There's a little bit more austerity, I think, to the berry fruit quality. Definitely, and I can't even refrain from saying this, but the limestone soils have a really unique way or impact on how the grapes grow, what types of minerals that are up to taken up into the plant. And I do always find that there's sort of a high mineral kind of taste to the wine, and that gives the wine a little bit more fatness and richness. The site doesn't deliver the same type of acidity as it does in Russian River, so the complexion of the wine, the acid complexion of the wine, and plus that minerality kind of gives the wine kind of more front to middle palate sort of weight, and the I don't say lack of acidity, but the site just doesn't tend to deliver that driving acidity like Russian River can. So it's a very unique expression. We're making these terrific wines from the really steep hillsides in this vineyard, and it's a great addition to our portfolio, right? Because it's so different.
Yeah, it is. It really does stand out, and it's a pretty wine too.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't really call it lighter bodied, but if you look at the east side tends to be a little more brooding, and the Vista is a little lighter than that.
Yeah.
For the sake of time, we're going to quickly move past that. I'm going to touch on another part of aging, and then we will taste the Bucher and Foss Vineyard next. Um, Someone had a question about, ageability again, which we really answered, but there's an important detail on that. Of course, these wines can age much longer than our recommendation, but a key point is with good storage, right? You want good temperature controlled storage. That's going to help with ageability. If you don't have great storage and you have a lot of variable temperature, I would definitely recommend drinking them on the earlier side. If you have great storage, a lot of these wines can go 10, 20 plus years. Now, every bottle of wine is different. Not every, Allen Vineyard of 20 years is going to be great just because of variability in storage and cork and all that. But Jeff and I have certainly shared some great old Williams Sonnier, and we know they can go long term.
Yeah.
The other point is you have to actually like what it turns into, because it changes. A lot of the fruit drops out, and those secondary and tertiary characteristics come in of more, leather and earth elements come in.
Yeah.
So just another little touch on aging, but that's a good segue to the Bucher, because I said earth, and I always think the Bucher is like our earthiest Pinot. So tell us a little bit about the 2020 Bucher Vineyard.
So this is on West Side Road, one of the components to West Side Road Neighbors Bottling, and the profile is so unique. It's definitely earthy, but once you kind of get past that, and this is actually a really good example, I think, that sort of earthiness. I mean, it's this is dairy country back here, back up in the hills on West Side Road. And I think that kind of contributes a little bit, I think, to the earthy character of the wine. But certainly with a little bit of age, that earthiness kind of gets consumed into the wine. As Mark said, I mean, the aging profile, wines tend to go from primary fruit character to secondary, which tend to be more on the earthier kind of mushroom side. And the interesting evolution, I think it was actually a 2012 Bucher that I had in the last month or so. And that wine, that earthiness almost completely goes away, and the wine becomes creamy and rich with raspberry and, and sort of like I often describe it as like raspberries and cream. That's typically what Bucher sort of ages into. Since about 2011, there have been some really exciting new plantings which we've had access to. So there's a really terrific combination of what I think my three favored clones that tend to play well together in the sandbox, and those are Pommard, Swan, and Mount Eden. So there's a really nice, blend of those different clones, and each one offering something slightly different. This wine's really rich. I mean, it's got it's a big mouthful, I think, from a tannin perspective, and certainly getting back to what I said earlier about the vintage in general, lots of tannin, I think, for the vintage. This wine, I think, would age really quite well.
I believe, Jeff, every time you say Pommard, there's a drinking game tied to that now.
I've only said it once, though, today.
Well, drink up, people. So, all right. We will go move on to the Foss Vineyard. So we talked about Foss a little bit when we were talking about East Side Road Neighbors. East Side Road Neighbors is a blend of Foss, McGregor, and Caligari. So it's just over the hillside from us. If you've ever been at the winery and looking out across, and there's Copan Winery, literally, if you kind of roll down the backside of Copan, which has been known to happen, you would end up in the Foss Vineyard. A great site for growing. It's really a hillside vineyard, and generally makes where would you put this, Jeff, in terms of stylistically? Is it on the lighter bodied side, on the heavier body side? I know what I think, but I like throwing these to you.
No, I think it's, kind of middle, middle ground in terms of, kind of profile. It oftentimes has that berry fruit quality, but, the site, tends to deliver a little bit less acidity compared to some of the other sites that we work with. And that's not a bad thing. It really kind of gives the wine unctuousness, right? And so, the berry fruit, there's a tiny little bit of earthiness, and in a different way than the Booker. I do like the concentration. I like the roundness of the wine, and that's really kind of one of the hallmarks, I think, of the Foss Vineyard. It's just it's so unctuous. And you should start a drinking game when I say unctuous, because I think I use that word a lot. But very round, kind of supple wine.
Yeah. We can, there's a lot of drinking games we can do around the tasting notes. But let's, I do think that the Foss definitely has that, that roundness that you're talking about,
Yeah.
which I sometimes say curb appeal. Like
Yeah.
people, if they just tried it, they just, they go, oh wow, this is awesome. And it's just immediate. It hits front palate, middle, and back at the same time.
Yeah, and when I talk about acidity, I mean there's obviously different whatever levels of acidity, and I love wines with great acidity because they give the wine drive. But that's kind of the unique thing about this site. I mean, the wine still has really terrific, concentration, but it has a round curb appeal. I like that actually, because it definitely has a roundness to it that a lot of people can enjoy, and it's one of those wines that you can certainly pop and pour. Right, it doesn't have to be necessarily overly complicated, but yeah, those are the kind of the signatures for the Foss Vineyard.
Although it is more fun to say unctuous. So,
Yeah.
All right. So moving within the East Side Road family, our next wine is the Lewis McGregor Estate Vineyard. Jeff was already describing this since we tried the Chardonnay earlier, so we won't get into the vineyard. We'll just talk a little bit about the wine.
Yeah.
I got to try this last night as well, and wow, this wine has an amazing wow factor to it.
Yeah.
It's similar to the Foss in terms of roundness, but the aromatics are intense. It's a gorgeous wine.
Yeah. Yeah, this is like I said, this is probably where we're going to start harvest next week. That's sort of an interesting picture right there, that cluster in the middle. Not sure exactly when this picture was taken, but you can kind of observe sort of the architecture of that cluster in the middle, right? It's kind of loose. Some of the berries are actually kind of on the smaller side. The smaller ones tend not to have any seeds in them, so they're really, these flavor bombs in a way. This wine is comprised of, guess what? A little bit of Pommard and Swan, 2/3 Pommard, 1/3 Swan. That's what this blend is typically made from. And either clone tends to deliver those tiny berries. And I describe it in the tasting notes often as hens and chicks, or Tom Rocchioli calls them peas and pumpkins, or the French mirandage. And the descriptor is always the same, which is big berry, little berry. And this wine, yeah, it has absolutely, I mean, the color is so dense. Those little chicks, the smaller berries, they're just anthocyanin color and structure, no juice, or very little juice for that matter. And so when you ferment the wines, you're getting all the color and the tannin structure in a smaller amount of juice in the fermentation, and that creates the concentration with the wine. Even though this is super close to the Foss Vineyard, it's literally down the road from the Foss Vineyard. But for whatever reason, rootstock, site, soil, this is sort of the opposite in the sense that it tends to have extremely high acidity. So this wine really works in the sense that you have this incredible concentration, which could lead the wine down a path of being overly unctuous and supple, but the acidity keeps it fresh, right? It keeps it lively on the palate. So it's a really interesting, I don't know, the site is really interesting because it delivers that sort of richness, but focus of acidity at the same time. Yeah, terrific wine.
Yeah, and so with 2022 vintage, how are yields looking?
Mm. It's early to say. The clusters are kind of on the small side right now, from what I'm seeing and some of the measurements that I've taken. Um, my suspicion is that it's an average um, yield to an average sort of minus, so slightly below average. Um, so yeah, I mean, again, all potentially good things for concentration. It's not what our CFO wants to hear, though. He wants to see more average kind of yields, but quality is going to be pretty terrific. So
Well, we got a lot of jokes there too, but we're getting short on time, so I'll move on. So the last Pinot before we jump into Zins is our Williams Sonoma Estate Vineyard Pinot Noir. So I'm up at our house at the top of the vineyard, and behind me through the shade you can see. Well, there you go. You can see our vineyard, and we pick a few specific clones for the Estate Vineyard Pinot Noir. I'll let Jeff get a little more into that. And it is kind of our most ageable wine, I would say, for Pinot Noirs, and generally is it's a wine that definitely benefits from age. I tried more than anything not to drink these wines when they're young because they do improve drastically with age. But I
yeah,
haven't tried the 2020 yet. So, Jeff, what do you think?
yeah. So as I described earlier, for whatever reason, the soil, the moisture in the soil, the microclimate on the west side of the river, we're picking a little bit later than, almost a week to 10 days later than the east side of the river. The fruit profile here tends to be, and this wine is just absolutely gorgeous in the sense that, I mean, such a contrast to the McGregor, which has that sort of berry, raspberry kind of fruit. Here, this is all about lighter red raspberry kind of fruit, red fruits in general. Beautiful perfume. To me, Pinot Noir can always be described. Great Pinot Noir should be described as perfume, perfumey. Um, a subtle amount of sort of nutmeg, early, I'm drawing a blank on what on the descriptor, sort of like nutmeg, allspice, those kind of earthy kind of spice elements, not necessarily from the oak, but I think really the quality of the tannins that we get from our estate site here. Oftentimes, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like the Allen vineyard in the sense that it has that beautiful perfume. It has this sort of quiet power, right? There's a lot of minerality, super refined tannin structure, lots of tannin, but very refined. So it's kind of sneaky in a way because the wine, as you mentioned, does have great aging potential. But the site, delivers these really super polished tannins that in a nice cold cellar can evolve for a long time. So
Yeah, I mean the finish on this wine is remarkable. It's really beautiful, and I think for there are I can't even remember how many 14 Pinots in this release. I think I think we've shown you three different regions. Well, Russian River and Central Coast, so two regions. But we also have Anderson Valley. We are in the Farrington, and really across the board, I think the wines we produced in 2020 are remarkable. Let's move off the Pinots and on to a couple of quick notes on two Zins as
yeah.
we are down to the 5-minute mark here.
Uh-oh.
So,
Okay.
First Zin is the Bacigalupi Zin. The Bacigalupi family has a vineyard about 4 or 5 miles up the road on West Side Road. Old vine Zin, planted between, if I recall, 80 and 100 years ago. Produces a tiny amount of fruit, and a wonderful family that farms it for us, a multi-generational wine growing family up there. So the Zins aromatically are just ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah. I mean,
like the raspberry, a little blueberry in this.
for sure. Yeah. No, it's oftentimes they describe it as like fruit bowl, right? You get the whole kind of red, blue, black fruit kind of complexion in the wine. And what I like to always point out with our Zinfandels is that we make them with the same mentality that we make the Pinot Noirs, right? So with two main differences. One, in the Pinot Noirs, we use whole cluster, um, which if you're familiar with our wines, all of our Pinot Noirs have a certain amount of whole cluster. Zinfandel does not, right? So the stems tend to be a little greener, so we want to omit them from the winemaking process. But we still use the dairy tanks. We do the foot treading, all that stuff. Zinfandel has the potential to be over extracted, right? So I think by taking the light-handedness, I think that a Pinot Noir winemaking, and certainly our Pinot Noir winemaking techniques, really deliver a wine with terrific balance and structure. The other difference is the type of barrel. So Mark mentioned earlier the Francois Frere with the Pinot Noirs. I exclusively use Taranso, which offers that kind of nice, balanced sort of almost invisible tannins to the structure of Zinfandel. This particular block is pure Zinfandel. So when you taste this wine, think pure Zin. Oftentimes, old vine Zins tend to be field blends with a lot of other varieties. So this is a very pure expression of Zinfandel. Great acidity, nice concentration, that fruit bowl characteristic. Also can age really well because of its nice acidity. Even though the alcohols tend to be a little bit more elevated in Zinfandel, and just maybe a quick side note, because a reason for that, Zinfandel, if you look at a Zinfandel cluster as it flowers, or even at the harvest time, there are varying degrees of actually a huge variation in the ripeness levels even within a given cluster. So in a lot of ways, we're waiting for the least ripe berries, or the ones that flowered last, to kind of catch up. And so typically those wines need to be in that 8 to 15 kind of percent alcohol range. Otherwise, the wines would be green and acidic and sort of have unripe flavors. And I know you don't want that in your Zinfandel. So typically we need to wait a little bit longer, get a little bit more hang time to get that balance of everything together. And unfortunately, that comes at a slight cost at a slightly higher alcohol level. But certainly with the acidity, the wines taste balanced, in my opinion.
I was just going to jump in, but they're balanced at 15.2, like this
Yeah.
Botticelli. And, I use these to pair with things that I don't normally pair Pinot with, because they can take a little more, they can take a little more spice. They can take a little more meat. They can take a little
Exactly.
more of everything. So the last wine we're going to taste today, and then I'll answer a couple of questions. It looks like we're going to go a couple of minutes long, but we'll try to wrap up by 5 past the latest, is our Cytone Zin. So we bought the Cytone vineyard in 2018 from the Cytone family that had farmsteaded it in the 1800s. The vineyards were planted in 1895. So, we're, well over 100 years at this point. They're all those gnarly head trained vines that are low to the ground, produce very little fruit. But we wanted to not just make wine from there, but preserve the heritage, because a lot of the old 100-plus-year-old Zinfandel vineyards don't make good business. And to the finance guy that was making comments earlier, we really, John Dyson has said, we're not run by bean counters. You don't make old vine Zin because you're trying to make money. It's because you love the wine and you want to protect the heritage of it. If on our website, we have a great video about the Cytone vineyard. So if you're ever bored and want to look at that, take some time on our website. But on this wine, Cytone is, I think, so distinctive. I feel like I could pick it out of a blind tasting almost any time.
It's quite unique. And so now we've gone from the Bacigalupi vineyard on West Side Road near the estate vineyard here to kind of the Piner Olivet area. So if you're familiar with that area. I mean, it's sort of flat and sort of nondescript. But what's really interesting, it sits in a part of the valley where there's very little fog intrusion, right? So or minimal fog intrusion, and Zinfandel is a variety that needs ripeness, right? So it needs a warmer climate to get, kind of as I described a little earlier, get all those different, berries at different sort of sugar levels, get them ripe. If it's too cold of a site, it's going to be acidic and it's going to be a green kind of tasting wine. So a lot of the old vine Zin, the Italian immigrants, they knew this and planted a lot of these vineyards. So the Papera vineyard, which is in the spring release, is 2 doors down from Cytone. Heritage planted it's 100 years planted in the 20s. Some other vineyards from say Carlisle or in the same sort of neighborhood. So high concentration of old vines. Yeah, very unique profile. I mean, high acid. Typically one of our wines that kind of struggle to go through malolactic. The malolactic bugs don't like too high of an acid, too low of a pH. So this kind of struggles to kind of get through it. But yeah, there's sort of a unique, I mean, to me, it's red fruit all the way through, right? And sometimes you'll hear me describe it as crunchy red fruit. So like cranberries, those kind of that kind of profile. And yeah, I could definitely pick this out of a lineup because it's so unique and different. This particular bottling is also pure Zinfandel.
Yeah.
So
I'm reading your notes, Jeff. I just have to ask, what the heck is goji berry?
Goji berry. So that's a crunchy red fruit, right? So yeah, it's so interesting when I'm coming up with these notes. It's getting harder and harder to find these kind of unique descriptors, but they come to me because, well, one, I'm a foodie, right? So I get to, I'm always kind of experimenting with foods and cuisines and that sort of thing. So that one kind of came up as like, oh, maybe I just had some goji berries. That's why it's in the tasting notes. But it's a crunchy red fruit category thing.
I did I wrote a set of tasting notes, one release, and it's way harder than anyone thinks, because when you're on your 12th Pinot, to try to find another way to say raspberry is really hard.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to hit a couple of questions and then we'll wrap up. So there's one question about what yeast strain do we use? And that's a really interesting one because, and the question was specific, do we use indigenous yeast? Yes and no. We use Williams Cellium yeast on every Pinot Noir we make, which is also indigenous to the site where we make the wine. Jeff, will you tell a little more about how we deal with yeast?
Yeah. So back in the day, Bert had isolated from a native yeast ferment a yeast strain that he thought had really, well, it was sort of interesting because it had really reliable kinetics. It was a very clean smelling yeast. Didn't require a lot of nutrient. Yeast is kind of interesting because it can put off aromas, and some yeast strains need a lot of nutrients to kind of go through the fermentation. But what he liked about what would become the Williams Cellium yeast is it was clean, didn't require a lot of nutrients, and it was reliable. And so those are all good qualities to have in a fermentation. You don't need fermentations taken, 20 or 30 days to finish, and then the wines are subject to invasion of like spoilage organisms and things like that create the smell of fingernail polish or all those kinds of things. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it was what is now defined as Williams Cellium yeast, but it came from a natural yeast ferment.
Yeah, and we still, so Bert had when he it's not trademarked, it's what would be the right term when
he isolated it, and
so people then buy the Williams Cellium yeast, and part of the profits come to us, which Bert started donating all of the profits from the yeast to the Healdsburg Library, which we still do to this day.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
another question on was just a simple, quantities on each wine. That's way too long of a question to get into, but in general, on the vineyard designates, we make somewhere between 250 and 700 of each bottling. The blends tend to be a little larger than that. It varies year to year. It varies vineyard to vineyard. We don't make a lot of any one wine, is the point. These are small lots, all all handpicked, done with an artisan quality to make the high level quality of wine that we're making. And on that boring note, I should have picked a more exciting thing. Yeast strains. We should have ended on yeast strains. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for all the questions and comments. Thank you for taking an hour out of your day to spend with Jeff and I. We are humbled to see the number of people on here, and humbled by the fact that you love our wine so much to spend this time. We appreciate you, and as I said before, the wines are going to go quick Monday, so jump in early. We hope you all get them, and there'll be a little more wine next year. So everyone, enjoy the wines. We appreciate you guys. See you soon.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining us.